Hey guys, what's going on? It's Ben here. I am back again today with another video. The topic of today's video is essentially going to be Mike Conley and trade possibilities that I have formulated for him. A bit of background information here. If you are unaware, the Memphis Grizzlies were not trying to tank this season. They were trying to be a contender and go forward and do well, make the playoffs, and they expected to do well with a healthy Conley and Gasol and rookie Jaren Jackson, who's played very well for them. And although they started good, I believe at one point they were like 11 and 5, and they were the 2 seed in the West early on. I just saw a statistic the other day that in their last 20 games they are 3 and 17. I believe their record is somewhere around like 19 and 27 now. They've definitely fallen off a cliff, and essentially for the first time ever, for the first time in like the last 3 or 4 years when we've all been thinking it but haven't really ever openly discussed it, the Grizzlies are now open to trading both Conley and Gasol and hitting the rebuild button. So with that being said, I went forward and came up with some trade scenarios for Mike Conley and some destinations that I think he could end up at. And so today I'm going to go through them. I've come up with five. Obviously, I could have come up with more, but I think five is just a good number just because otherwise the video would get a little long. So without further ado, I'm going to get into them. And now the teams that I'm going to start with are the ones where I think it's the teams that I'm going, excuse me, the teams I'm going to end with are more like the contenders where it have a much bigger impact. I think he would have an impact on any of these trades, but the teams at the beginning less so than the teams at the end. Just so you know that, in case you're like, man, all these teams that he has him going to are like bottom feeders. That's not necessarily the case, and I am going to discuss these in the order that I think it would be most impactful to the team he'd be going to. Okay, so starting off, the first trade I have on here is Mike Conley going to the Phoenix Suns. I picked the Phoenix Suns basically just because they don't have an NBA point guard right now. I'd say that they have guys such as I think D'Anthony Melton is on their team, and Eli Okobo, but those guys really don't cut it at point guard in my opinion. So I thought, who could really use a point guard? The Suns. So that being said, I orchestrated this trade so that Mike Conley would go there. In return, the Memphis Grizzlies would be getting Josh Jackson, the number 3 overall pick in the 2017 draft. Also, Mikal Bridges, the 10th pick in this last draft, 2018. And then the contract of Ryan Anderson, who is making $20 million a year, but I believe this year is the last year of his contract, or possibly next year. I think it's actually next year, but there's like an option on it this year, but he will likely opt in because it's paying him a ton of money and it's more than he's worth. So the Grizzlies in return don't get a huge great haul, but then again, it's not like Mike Conley is a perennial all-star, so does he necessarily deserve a massive haul? I don't really know. So I think Mikal Bridges actually might be the best piece that they're getting back here. Josh Jackson is a nice piece too with some upside, but so far in Phoenix he's been a bit of a bust. And then Ryan Anderson likely wouldn't play that much. He'd just sort of be a bench player or not even playing at all. But really what you get here is a chance to kind of clear the deck, and basically after next year, you would be free of a lot of the cap space that they had locked up with Conley, and then you'd have two nice young prospects in return for Conley. So that's the first trade I have on here. And in return, Phoenix gets a point guard in the middle of his prime who can help develop Devin Booker and DeAndre Ayton, and then you kind of have a nice solid starting trio of those three: Booker, Ayton, and Conley, and then probably a high draft pick in this next draft, which they can also flip um, to, or no, not flip, excuse me. They can get another high draft pick who could add to this core as well. Okay, moving forward, the second trade I have on here is Mike Conley going to the Milwaukee Bucks. Now they are a contender and they are good, but the reason I have them at as a second team and not further back is because I feel like a trade for Mike Conley wouldn't really move the needle that much for the Bucks. I have Memphis in return getting Eric Bledsoe, who's on an expiring contract, and George Hill, who I believe has an option but he will likely opt in as he's making a boatload of money, 19 million. So the Bucks get the best player in this trade in Mike Conley, and they do upgrade at their starting point guard spot. They lose some depth in that they lose George Hill, who's a nice combo guard off the bench, but again, they do get the best player in the draft. In return, Memphis can get that $15 million off the books from Eric Bledsoe, and then they can go out and try and retool or try and re-sign him if they want. And then as far as George Hill, they can basically just leave him on the bench and he can be dead salary. And although that's not super appealing, if they're looking to tank, he could kind of help in that he'd be taking up a lot of the salary cap, and then they don't have to go out and sign a player to a huge bloated contract that they don't deserve. This is sort of a move that could go either way for the Grizzlies. It could either be like, man, we really want to tank, so they acquire these two and then let Bledsoe go and don't play George Hill really. Or if they say we still want to contend that's in some way, shape, or form, but we just don't think Conley's the guy, you can try and re-sign Eric Bledsoe and then maybe, um, I don't know what you'd try and do with George Hill, but you could just play him and see how he works with the team. But really, the main reason for this trade is that Milwaukee gets a better starting point guard, and they're maybe able to do slightly better in their playoff push. Next, I have a trade between the Grizzlies and the Dallas Mavericks. This is a trade I like a lot, and I actually think it's probably the most equal for each team as far as like what they're getting in return for what they're giving up, and I think it actually benefits both teams as well. So I have Dallas getting Mike Conley and Kyle Anderson in exchange for Wesley Matthews, Dwight Powell, and Dennis Smith Jr. Okay, so for Dallas's side, you give up Wes Matthews, who is, starting and doing decent for you, but he has a really huge contract and he's expiring, and they didn't plan to re-sign him, so really nothing lost there. You get Dennis Smith Jr. out of there, who really hadn't been meshing all that well with Luka Doncic, so you get him out of there. You don't really have to worry about their chemistry issues anymore. And then you give up Dwight Powell, who is, a decent player, but he kind of sweetens the pot for Memphis to want to do this because essentially, if you don't include him, then you're really only giving up. Um, you're really only getting back Dennis Smith Jr. because then Wes Matthews is just gonna leave after he's gone in free agency. So really, I feel like you have to include Dwight Powell just to kind of sweeten the pot. He is having a pretty good year as a supporting player in Dallas, and I think you could carry that over to Memphis, especially if they trade Marc Gasol. Then you could put in Dwight Powell and Jaren Jackson as your starting front court, and they would do all right. Very young and raw, but they would do all right. And then for Dallas, Mike Conley would slot in nicely to the point guard spot, and then I think Kyle Anderson could be their starting small forward. Their starting lineup would probably look something like Conley, Luka, Kyle Anderson. As power forward, you probably, or the other forward spot, I should say, you have Harrison Barnes, and then starting center DeAndre Jordan. The only alteration you could really make to this trade that would essentially make some sense too is you could just leave out Dwight Powell and Kyle Anderson, but I think it makes sense just to include them, just to kind of give Memphis a little bit more of a sweetener to take the deal, that they get a nice player in Dwight Powell, who I would say is like slightly better than Kyle Anderson. So yeah. But yeah, I like this trade for both teams. Memphis gets kind of a nice young rebuilding piece in Dennis Smith Jr., and Dallas seems to be trending towards trying to contend again, and they get a nice contender in, or not contender, excuse me, they get a nice building block for that in Mike Conley. Okay, the next team I have on here is the San Antonio Spurs. I have the Grizzlies getting Pau Gasol, Davis Bertans, and Derek White, and I have the Spurs getting Mike Conley. So basically here, again, it would have to be sort of like Memphis is willing to take not that much in return and just trying to unload Conley because they want to tank. And although I don't see them being super willing to do that, there are some like silver linings that you can get out of this trade. Oh, I also would have to include a first round pick going to Memphis in this trade. All right, now San Antonio gets a pretty good deal. Their starting lineup after this would probably look something like Conley, DeRozan, Rudy Gay, LaMarcus Aldridge, and I'm trying to think of who else would play or be in the starting lineup. You'd probably have, let's see here. probably have Conley, Bryn Forbes, DeMar DeRozan, Rudy Gay, and LaMarcus Aldridge as your starting lineup. For the Grizzlies, you get Davis Bertans, who's currently making 45% of his three-pointers, shooting between 4 and 5 a game, which is a great percentage, and hopefully he could keep that up in Memphis, who always perpetually is in need of shooting, it seems like. They also get a guy in Derek White who's been very promising this year, actually getting some significant minutes as a starter. He is not going to light the world on fire, but I feel like um, he isn't a. I don't know if he's a starting caliber NBA point guard, but he's like a super good backup. So I don't know where that leaves you. And then Pau Gasol, he's just making a boatload of cash, and he can basically be filler for this trade. And then if you include a first round draft pick, I feel like that might be enough to get Memphis to do that trade. There sort of has to be an intersection point for Memphis to do this trade of like desperation and like it's gonna be like, well, how badly do we really want to get rid of Conley? They're gonna have to kind of come to that conclusion of how badly they want to get rid of him. And if it's like, man, we want him gone no matter what, just to try and rebuild and get going, then I think they would take this trade. But they're not getting a ton back really, so I don't see them taking this trade unless they're like, yes, we're committed to rebuilding and starting from the ground up and completely starting over. Okay, now moving on to my last trade with the New Orleans Pelicans and the Memphis Grizzlies. This one I think would help make the biggest impact. That's why I saved it for last. So the Pelicans are again trying to uh, boost their chances of keeping Anthony Davis by bringing in a guy who can make significant contributions and help them push for the playoffs. I think they're currently 22 and 25, and they're like the 13 seed in the West, which seems really low, but honestly, their record, like if they win 3 straight games, they're like the 9 seed, and then it just takes like 2 more to get into the playoff hunt, so or to get into the playoff picture. So really, like it's attainable if they make the right deals. So now, what do I have them giving Memphis? I have them giving them their first round pick along with Wesley Johnson, Etuan Moore, and Solomon Hill. So basically, Wes Johnson and Solomon Hill are expiring contracts, and they're just thrown in here because Memphis can get between the two of them about $19 million off the books next year and kind of have some free cap space to do what they wish. Uh, then they get Etuan Moore, who's a really solid rotation piece. You could either have him as a starter or coming off the bench. He would work well as either that, like a starter or a six man. And then a first round pick just to, again, sweeten the pot and entice Memphis to do this more. And really, why would Memphis take this again if they were desperate and they were really committed to rebuilding and they were like, we don't want to be uh, 39 and 43 at the end of the season and end up with like the 12th pick. We want to end up with the sixth pick or fifth pick or something like that. They just have to be really committed to rebuilding to be willing to take this trade. So, because honestly, this trade comes down to Etuan Moore and a pick for Mike Conley after these contracts expire between Solomon Hill and Wesley Johnson. And so I don't, that's not really what Mike Conley's worth. But if they're really trying to rebuild, they would take this trade. Okay, and then on New Orleans' side, you get a starting lineup that looks like Conley, Drew Holiday, then probably Darius Miller, um, Julius Randle, and Anthony Davis with Nikola Mirotic as your sixth man. You could also make Mirotic a small forward in some scenarios. They did that a bit last year and it worked well. So like you could have your depth lineup as like Conley, Drew Holiday, Mirotic, Randle, and Anthony Davis. That'd be a pretty kick butt core of 5 players, really good on offense. Mike Conley is the best defensive player on that all of the players in this trade too. He's an upgrade over Etuan Moore as a wing defender, so I think that he would fit in well with Drew Holiday as well, because Drew Holiday's trying to transition more to that full-time shooting guard position, so he would alleviate um, the playmaking responsibilities from Drew. And then also I still had them keeping Elfrid Payton so he could come in and back him up, and then Drew would never have to take over as point guard and could fully commit to shooting guard responsibilities. That being said, I'm going to quickly just go through Mike Conley's stats just so you know the kind of play he's been up to this season. So this year he has been shooting 42% from the field, 35% from three, pretty in line with his career stat line there. Free throws, he's shooting 85%, which is one of the highest for his career actually. And then he's averaging 3 rebounds a game, 6 assists a game, 1 steal a game, and his second highest points average per game for his career at 20, because they've been giving him his highest amount of shots he's ever gotten per game at 16. So I feel like, if there's a time to trade him where his value is high, it would be this season. That being said, if you have trade suggestions that you think would be good for Memphis to take, you should let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear them, and I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I hope you have a good day. All right, see you guys. Bye.